Welcome to this documentary on the Hells Angels, a club that's been both feared and admired for decades. From their humble beginnings in the late 1940s to becoming one of the most infamous motorcycle clubs in the world, this is the full story. We'll take you through their origins, the rise of their global influence, the wars they've fought, and the criminal activities that have often kept them in the headlines. Everything is laid out from the very start, right up to the present day. So, what makes the Hells Angels tick, and why does their legend still capture our attention? Let's find out. It all began in 1948, when a group of World War II veterans, looking for something more than the everyday grind, came together in Fontana, California. These weren't your average guys. They were tough, battle-hardened, and ready to live life on their own terms. With their military background, they weren't looking to settle into the typical suburban lifestyle that most of their peers were falling into. They wanted freedom, excitement, and a bit of rebellion. That's when the Hells Angels were born. At first, the name was just a way to give their group a bit of edge. It was inspired by a World War II bomber squadron called the Hells Angels, and it was meant to represent toughness, courage, and an unwillingness to follow the rules. But they weren't just out there to act tough. They wanted a place where they could be themselves without being judged. They wanted a club that stood for something different. Initially, the club wasn't some massive world-renowned name. It was small, just a handful of members hanging out, sharing their love of motorcycles, and enjoying the freedom of the open road. They were just a bunch of guys who loved bikes, but it quickly became more than that. The sense of brotherhood they had was unlike anything else, and before long, they started recruiting other like-minded individuals. By the early 1950s, the Hells Angels had already built a reputation. But it wasn't all about the wild rides and custom motorcycles. They were still a relatively tight-knit crew, only a few chapters scattered around California. They weren't looking to cause trouble, at least not on the scale they would later be known for. What started as a small group of vets soon expanded to more chapters, spreading through California and eventually across the United States. But here's the thing. It wasn't just the love of motorcycles that kept them together. There was something deeper, something that made them stick out in a world that seemed to be increasingly obsessed with conformity. They weren't just rebelling against the mainstream, they were creating their own world, one where they called the shots, and the rules were theirs to break. By the time the 1960s rolled around, the Hells Angels had truly started to make a name for themselves. They were no longer just a local group of bikers. They were a global symbol of defiance, freedom, and living life on their own terms. And with that fame, their image grew bigger and bolder. They weren't just about riding anymore. The counterculture movement of the 1960s, with its focus on rejecting authority, rebellion, and alternative lifestyles, found a kindred spirit in the Hells Angels. They became linked to the larger rock and roll scene, particularly the hippie movement. Suddenly, they were rubbing shoulders with musicians, artists, and political activists, all of whom were pushing against the traditional boundaries of society. It was the perfect storm, rebellious bikers meeting free-spirited youth, and the Hells Angels were right in the thick of it. But being at the heart of the counterculture didn't mean they were all peace and love. In fact, the Hells Angels were known for their no-nonsense attitude, and when it came to dealing with others, they made it clear that they weren't the type to back down. Their biker jackets, their 1% ear patch, which signified that they were the 1% of bikers who didn't follow the law, and their tough, wild image were all part of the package. At the same time, there was something else brewing within the Hells Angels, something that would eventually overshadow their image as just a group of rebellious bikers. For now, in the late 40s and early 50s, the Hells Angels were creating the foundations of something that would eventually grow into one of the most powerful, controversial, and feared motorcycle clubs in history. They weren't just a group of guys riding motorcycles, they were crafting a legend, and no one could have predicted where that would take them. By the mid-1950s, the Hells Angels were no longer just a small group of California veterans. They had begun to expand beyond their home base in San Bernardino, and with this expansion, their image grew even bigger. They were no longer just another motorcycle club. They were becoming something much more significant. Their reputation was spreading, and what was once a few local chapters soon became a global network of chapters. The Hells Angels weren't interested in blending into society. Instead, they were making their own rules, carving out a world where their version of freedom was the only thing that mattered. But it wasn't just about geographical expansion. The Hells Angels had a code of conduct that helped them stay united despite the growing number of chapters. As new chapters popped up in places like Canada and Europe, the club established a strict set of rules to maintain the integrity of their brand. At the heart of it was loyalty to the club, which meant everything. This sense of brotherhood was part of what made the Hells Angels stand out. By the early 1960s, the Hells Angels were spreading like wildfire. As their presence grew, so did their notoriety. The club's influence was undeniable. Each new chapter added to their mystique and their power. But with that power came attention, and not all of it was positive. With their rebellious nature and disregard for the rules, the Hells Angels started to make headlines for all the wrong reasons. While they still had strong ties to the counterculture, their interactions with the police became less about fighting the system and more about avoiding it. They were accused of being involved in organized crime, drugs, and violence. But the Hells Angels weren't intimidated. They weren't a typical gang, and they weren't about to play by anyone's rules. In the mid-60s, the Hells Angels reached the peak of their cultural relevance, coinciding with the Summer of Love and the rise of the hippie movement. Many young people admired the club for their refusal to conform to society's expectations, but this admiration was mixed with fear. After all, the Hells Angels weren't exactly known for their peaceful protests or flower power. They were known for their intimidating presence, their loyalty to each other, and their willingness to throw down if the situation called for it. One of the defining moments of the Hells Angels' rise to fame came in 1969 at the infamous Altamont Free concert. The Rolling Stones had hired the Hells Angels to serve as security, and what was supposed to be a peaceful event turned into a violent disaster. The chaos that erupted, including the stabbing of a concertgoer, cemented the Hells Angels' reputation as more than just a gang of bikers. They were a symbol of chaos, rebellion, and destruction. The media pounced on the story, and the Hells Angels became even more infamous overnight. But despite the bad press, the Hells Angels didn't just disappear. They kept growing, pushing into new territories, and expanding their influence. The group had become a global brotherhood, but not just any brotherhood. The Hells Angels were known for their strict codes, their tight-knit chapters, and their ability to adapt to whatever challenges came their way. And while they might have been vilified in the media, they had a loyalty to each other that couldn't be shaken. For them, it wasn't about what the outside world thought. It was about sticking together and living life the only way they knew how. By the end of the 60s, the Hells Angels had not only survived the ups and downs of the counterculture, but had used it to fuel their rise to a worldwide reputation. Their image was no longer just about motorcycles. It was about a way of life that was all their own, one that ignored laws, rejected norms, and embraced a sense of power and freedom that few could understand, let alone challenge. And while the Hells Angels were expanding and growing more powerful, their story was far from over. The real turning points, where their path would cross with the law, rival gangs, and their own internal struggles, were just starting to unfold. As the Hells Angels grew in size and influence, so did the trouble that followed them. No longer just a group of bikers enjoying the open road, they were now deeply intertwined with a world of crime, violence, and illegal activities that many had feared from the very start. The more power the club gained, the more it attracted attention, not all of it positive. By the 1970s, the Hells Angels were no longer just about the ride. They were legends in the underworld, involved in everything from drug trafficking to extortion. The club's name became synonymous with danger. They weren't just seen as an outlaw motorcycle gang anymore, but as a criminal organization with vast reach, operating like a network across the globe. The Hells Angels weren't just living outside the law, they were shaping it, or at least trying to. One of the most significant shifts in the club's story came when the Hells Angels started dealing with drugs, particularly methamphetamine and cocaine. These were highly profitable businesses that gave the club both wealth and power. But with that came the constant threat of law enforcement, rival gangs, and the constant internal struggle to maintain control of such a lucrative enterprise. The club's illicit businesses included everything from human trafficking to the more mundane, but still illegal activities like fraud and money laundering. The rise of the Hells Angels in the criminal world didn't go unnoticed. Their rise to power sparked conflict not only with law enforcement. One infamous clash came with the Mongols. By the 1980s, the Hells Angels and the Mongols had a bitter rivalry that often turned deadly. The conflict wasn't just about local turf. It became about pride, respect, and dominance in the world of outlaw motorcycle clubs. But criminal activity wasn't the only thing threatening to tear the Hells Angels apart. As the years went on, the club had to deal with internal issues. With the rise in members and chapters came growing rivalries within the club itself. Power struggles, disagreements over how to run things, and issues of loyalty often led to violent confrontations within their own ranks. Some chapters weren't as loyal to the central leadership, leading to conflicts that made it harder for the Hells Angels to keep their operations running smoothly. At the same time, law enforcement was catching up with them. They didn't just go after individual members, they went after the entire network, using everything from wiretaps to undercover agents. This was a major turning point for the Hells Angels. Suddenly, they were not just being watched by local cops, they were being investigated by federal agencies who were determined to put an end to their reign of criminal activity. But the Hells Angels weren't only known for their criminal actions. They had also built up an empire of legitimate businesses to help launder money and give their operations a more polished image. From motorcycle shops to bars and restaurants, the Hells Angels were using their legitimate businesses to fund their illegal activities. However, the constant battle against law enforcement, rival gangs, and internal divisions continued to take its toll. The Hells Angels of the late 80s and early 90s weren't the same group of young rebels who had started out in the 1940s. The club had become a worldwide network with criminal operations that spanned continents. And with that came the pressure, the violence, and the unending challenge of trying to stay on top. As the world moved into the 2000s, the Hells Angels' presence in the criminal world didn't fade. In fact, they remained a major player in the underworld. Their operations remained strong, even as they faced growing legal challenges and internal struggles. But there was one thing that remained constant throughout: the club's ability to adapt, to stay united, and to keep living their version of freedom, no matter the cost. What makes the Hells Angels so unique? Sure, they're known for their criminal connections and their rugged, rebellious image, but there's something much deeper that binds them together. At its core, the Hells Angels isn't just a motorcycle club, it's a brotherhood. And like any brotherhood, it's built on loyalty, respect, and a strict code that governs everything they do. The 1% patch that members wear proudly on their jackets isn't just a badge, it's a statement. It's a reminder that they represent the 1% of the world that doesn't follow the rules, the outlaws who refuse to conform to society's expectations. The patch is a symbol of freedom, of rejecting the mainstream, and it's part of what gives the club its edge. It's also what sets them apart from the countless other motorcycle clubs around the world. When you see that 1% on someone's jacket, you know exactly who they are and what they stand for. But the Hells Angels aren't just about the look. There's a whole world behind that patch, a world full of rituals, secrets, and a strong sense of brotherhood that keeps the club intact despite everything. Joining the Hells Angels isn't as simple as showing up and buying a leather jacket. It's a process. It's about proving your loyalty, earning your place, and respecting the rules of the club. First, a potential new member isn't just handed a patch. They have to go through a period known as the prospect phase. This is essentially a trial period where a person shows their dedication to the club. During this time, they perform menial tasks, help out with club events, and prove that they're willing to go the extra mile for the brothers. They aren't yet full members, but they have to earn the trust and respect of the other members. Once someone has made it through the prospect phase and has earned their place, they are finally given the coveted Hells Angels patch. But that's just the beginning. The Hells Angels have a strict hierarchy. And while every member is considered a brother, not all brothers are equal. The leadership within the club is organized, and there's a lot of respect given to those who've been in the club the longest or those who have contributed the most to its growth. At the top of the hierarchy are the presidents of each chapter, who have the final say in decisions. They're followed by vice presidents, sergeants at arms, and other officers who help run the day-to-day operations of the club. But even with all the structure, there's still an element of anarchy within the group. The Hells Angels may follow a code, but they're not about following orders blindly. Members are expected to think for themselves, and the club respects individuality as long as it doesn't conflict with the brotherhood. One of the key aspects that ties the Hells Angels together is their sense of loyalty. For many members, the club is more than just a group of guys you hang out with. It's a family. The bond between members is unbreakable. and that loyalty extends beyond just the club itself. It's a way of life that defines everything they do, from how they handle conflicts to how they deal with outsiders. But this isn't just about hanging out and riding bikes together. The Hells Angels have a ritualistic side to their club that's steeped in tradition. They have their own ways of marking milestones, handling disputes, and paying respect to their fallen brothers. For instance, when a member dies, the Hells Angels have a way of honoring them that is unique to the club. They don't just mourn the loss, they celebrate the life and the brotherhood they shared with the deceased. And it's not just about the rituals, there's a cultural element as well. The Hells Angels have created a subculture all their own, blending biker culture with a sense of rebellion and freedom that's hard to describe. They're not just interested in motorcycles, they're interested in creating a lifestyle, a world where they can be themselves without judgment. Whether it's throwing wild parties, riding together in huge packs, or simply living life in the fast lane, being a Hells Angel means being part of something that's larger than life. But here's the kicker. This world of loyalty and brotherhood doesn't come without its dark side. The sense of camaraderie among Hells Angels members is intense, but it's also protective. If someone threatens the club or its members, they will quickly find that crossing the Hells Angels isn't something they want to do. This brotherhood isn't about being nice to everyone. It's about standing your ground and protecting your own. This loyalty can turn dangerous, especially when the club's illegal activities are threatened. As the Hells Angels expanded, they attracted more attention, not just from the police, but from other groups and organizations who wanted a piece of the pie. But the Hells Angels weren't about to hand over any control. Whether it was rival gangs, law enforcement, or even within the club itself, the Hells Angels knew how to keep things under control. And that's what has kept them going all these years, this deep, unshakable bond that ties them together. So, while the outside world might see the Hells Angels as a bunch of rebels with bikes, the truth is much more layered. The Hells Angels are a brotherhood, a world built on respect, loyalty, and a lifestyle that not many can understand or replicate. And that's exactly how they like it. From the beginning, the Hells Angels had a complicated relationship with law enforcement. Their name alone was enough to spark suspicion, and as the club grew, so did the attention they received from police. Their involvement in criminal activities like drug trafficking, extortion, and violence made them prime targets for investigations. The FBI and ATF quickly took interest in their operations, seeing them as a threat to national security. The club's global network of chapters meant they were hard to track, but that didn't stop authorities from trying. Over the years, there have been countless raids, arrests, and prosecutions aimed at breaking the Hells Angels' grip on the underworld. Despite the constant legal pressure, the club remained resilient, often turning public perception in their favor by embracing their rebellious image. For many members, fighting the law was part of the lifestyle, and as long as they stuck together, they felt untouchable. The Hells Angels' rise didn't come without challenges. As their influence spread, they clashed with other outlaw motorcycle gangs. The Mongols, outlaws, and pagans were among their fiercest rivals, each fighting for control of territories and illegal operations. These turf wars were brutal, with violence erupting over everything from drug routes to club honor. The constant fighting led to bloodshed and tension within the biker world. Yet, the Hells Angels' tight-knit brotherhood kept them united. While rival gangs often tore each other apart, the Angels remained resolute, following their code of loyalty and showing no signs of backing down. The constant conflict only served to strengthen their position and reputation in the criminal underworld. Today, the Hells Angels remain one of the most recognizable and feared motorcycle clubs worldwide. While their criminal activities may have quieted in some regions due to law enforcement crackdowns, their reputation still looms large. They've adapted to the modern world, finding new ways to operate while holding on to their rebellious spirit. But they continue to maintain the core values of loyalty, brotherhood, and freedom. Even with the changing times, the Hells Angels still represent an alternative lifestyle, one that challenges the system and pushes back against authority. The Hells Angels are polarizing. To some, they're heroes, living outside the confines of a society that values conformity. The club's image has always been one of defiance, and they've often embraced it, whether it's riding through town in massive packs or raising hell at events. But despite their controversial reputation, the Hells Angels have made a lasting impact on both pop culture and the criminal world. Their image has been co-opted by people who want to project toughness, independence, and rebellion, traits that resonate with anyone who feels marginalized or disconnected from mainstream society. However, the legacy of the Hells Angels is complicated. The club's criminal activities, including drug dealing, violence, and racketeering, have caused untold harm. They've clashed with law enforcement, rival gangs, and even their own members over the years. The cycle of violence and conflict seems to be part of their DNA. And yet, there's no denying the sense of loyalty and brotherhood that holds them together, qualities that are rare in a world driven by self-interest. Despite their criminal activities, the Hells Angels have managed to survive and thrive for decades. They've weathered scandals, legal crackdowns, and internal conflict, and yet they remain one of the most formidable outlaw organizations in the world. In a sense, their ability to endure, to adapt to changing times while maintaining their core values, is a testament to the strength of their brotherhood. But are they heroes or villains? It depends on who you ask. For some, they represent the ultimate freedom, a life without rules or restrictions. For others, they're a reminder of what happens when a group decides to live outside the law, no matter the cost. As we look ahead, the future of the Hells Angels is anything but certain. They've managed to survive for more than 70 years, adapting to new challenges and evolving in the face of shifting laws, social changes, and fierce competition from other groups. Today, they're more than just a motorcycle club. They've become a symbol of defiance, a representation of those who choose to live on their own terms. While their criminal activities have been significantly reduced in some areas, the Hells Angels continue to maintain a strong presence in the world. They still gather in huge numbers, still throw massive events, and still ride their bikes in a show of unity and defiance. And with the rise of social media and modern technology, they've found new ways to connect, organize, and maintain their reputation as one of the most notorious organizations in the world. But despite their ongoing influence, the club's grip on the criminal underworld has loosened. Law enforcement has become increasingly effective at targeting criminal organizations like the Hells Angels. And as younger generations come up, the allure of a life of rebellion and crime might not hold the same appeal. The world is changing, and so are the Hells Angels. However, one thing is clear: the Hells Angels are far from gone. Their legacy, both the good and the bad, continues to shape the world they helped create. The club's story isn't just about bikes and outlaws. It's about survival, brotherhood, and the unyielding desire to live outside the lines of society. The question remains: will they continue to thrive, or will they slowly fade away, their legend becoming nothing more than a piece of history? As we ride into the future, one thing is certain: the Hells Angels will always be a part of the world they've created. Whether you see them as heroes or villains, there's no denying that their story will be remembered for generations to come.